All right. So good afternoon for those of you in Europe, and good morning for those in North America. This is Monika Freyman from Ceres. I direct the Investor Water Engagement Program. And welcome to our monthly speaker series of the Investor Water Hub. And today we have the excellent topic of scientifically assessing water performance of investments with guest speakers from PGGM and the City University of New York. Before we turn it to the speakers, I just wanted to remind everyone that we are going to be muting the lines due to the large number of folks joining us. And if you have any questions, please turn to the left-hand side of the slides, and you can ask a question either by clicking by your name and raising your hand, or please do just put a question in the chat box down by the left-hand corner. Also, it is often better to dial in via the conference call lines via another device than the computer for better quality if you're having any quality issues. And if you have any questions about the logistics or you're having problems dialing in, please feel free to use the chat line as well, and Ceres will help you. So without further ado, this is a monthly speaker series of the Investor Water Hub. We often have closed-door discussions around different water issues that are relevant to institutional investors. And the Investor Water Hub, for those of you that are not familiar or have not been on our calls before, is a working group of Ceres Investor Network. We have over 100 institutions now, part of this working group across the globe, really interested as investors to learn more about water issues and more fully and comprehensively consider water in their investment decision-making processes. I am very much part of a team and privileged and delighted to have both Robin Miller and Hugh Brown as Investor Water Hub team members. So if anyone has any questions or would like to follow up with Ceres on some of our work on water, either with investors or corporations, feel free to reach out to any of us. And if there's any investors on the line that are not part of the hub and want to learn more, feel free to reach out to us as well. We do want to take the time to thank our advisory committee members in particular who are listed on this slide and give us a lot of advice and are invaluable team members too. So one of the projects of the Investor Water Hub as a working group was to produce just this past year the Investor Water Toolkit, which is a public resource for the investment community around water and really giving methods, databases, resources for investors to consider water issues. I did want to announce quickly that we have, in addition to our online resource and platform, now also produced a PDF and a tear sheet, so a really short summary of all the recommendations and a PDF version of the deeper recommendations due to popular demand. So folks really wanted that PDF. But I think one of the reasons I'm really excited by the speakers today is one of the major recommendations that came through from investors and our work on water is that as investors really try to understand water issues and really build a set of priorities around water, there were three components that are seen as really critical. One is to put investment policies in place, to really have guiding principles and policies to align staff and really understand what top priorities are on water. The second is really to have the practices in place. So then, influenced by your policies, what practices do you want to weave into your research, into your engagements with companies, and really set a set of practices in place. But then the third component really is around performance, is investors trying to track a set of KPIs and really understand their performance on water or broader environmental, social, or governance issues as well. And often investors really struggle with the performance piece. There are certainly a lot of good policies and practices in place, but the ability for investors to actually assess their performance on water or other ESG issues is an area of sort of nascent and growing interest, but certainly a lot of developing practices. And I think the discussion we're going to have today and our speakers are going to be talking about is really at the forefront of really trying to look at performance. So really super excited to introduce our speakers now. So I'm delighted to have both Charlie Vörösmarty from the City University of New York, and Dr. Vörösmarty heads the Research Center on Human-Environment Interactions, and he leads many teams across the globe on interdisciplinary studies, really looking at earth systems, water, human security, and aquatic biodiversity issues, and has just an incredible mind for connecting pragmatic private sector issues with science. So really delighted to have Charlie speaking on the call today. I'm first going to turn it to Piet Klop. And Piet, if you have been following investor water issues, then you certainly do know Piet. He has been a real thought leader and pioneer in institutional investors really needing to understand global water issues. And he is working with PGGM, one of the largest pension funds in the Netherlands. And I will now turn it over to Piet to introduce the study that we're going to be discussing on our conference call. Piet?
Yeah, thank you. And you'll flip through my slides, right? Yeah, back. Yeah, exactly. My name is Piet Klop. I'm with PGGM, and I'll just talk about the starter to the main course that Charlie will serve. I think a few things that may be helpful in understanding why we're even interested in measuring the impact of our investments. PGGM moved about 4 years ago from a desire to do less bad to more good, and has articulated 4 themes back then. This was pre-SDG, mind you. Climate, water, food, and health, on which it wanted to make a positive impact. And the target that we're pursuing is 20 billion euros in positive impact investments by the end of 2020. Now, the 4 original themes, climate, water, food, and health, were mapped to the menu of themes that you see here at this slide, the SDGs. It's important that, being a fiduciary, being a pension fund or a pension fund manager, we are always beholden to making market rate investment returns. So even if we talk about impact, this is not at the expense of a financial return that we require from a particular asset class. So it's market rate returns that we are aiming for in combination with impact. And that impact we would like to measure, because we believe that unless you measure it, chances are you're just going through the motions and may not necessarily change anything on the ground. Now, in setting ourselves a big target, 20 billion by 2020, it's obvious that you can't just get there by investing in private markets, private real estate, private equity, infrastructure. So we also firing on all cylinders. We also have a go at this through secondary markets, equities and bonds. And it's on the equity side that we've defined a 2.5 billion euro mandate. And that is the one that I'll spend the rest of this 5 minutes talking about. Next slide, please. In fencing off a 2.5 billion euro mandate, we built this on the basis of distinct impact or plausible impact on either one of these 4 themes. So the first question is, what solutions are we aiming for? For that, we built, together with APG, a taxonomy. We started with the 4 original themes, and we broadened out to the entire list of the SDGs. Here's the one you see for water. So it's a big step already for a pension fund manager to even think about specific solutions that further that particular SDG. So we try to define those in these taxonomies. The next question and the next slide is, if indeed you know what you're looking for by way of taxonomies, which companies then do produce enough of those taxonomies to merit inclusion in that separate universe that we were pulling together? So this is a short version of the process we went through. What we did is we compiled thematic lists. We had a very basic screen, the Global Compact, to do away with the real evil companies. And then we started looking at their numbers. So you could be included in that universe on the basis of your sales and become a majority player. Think about Vestas as a typical company in that regard. That's sales of 50% or more that are derived from these solutions that we identified earlier. If you're not a pure play or a majority play, you can still be included because you could be a decisive play, as we called it. This may be a good example here, Siemens, where it's not quite the case that they derive 50% or more of their revenues from these solutions, but it turns out that they are a very big market player. Their market share in wind turbines, for example, is actually bigger than Vestas. So it's either sales or market share. And there's a few exceptions. Unilever comes to mind, that got into this universe on the basis of their all-round leadership in sustainability. There's only a handful of companies that got in there. The total list of companies was 350 names. It's being updated every year. Now, this is a two-step process. So first we build the universe, and from that universe, two fund managers are drawing their portfolios on very conventional financial criteria. We split the mandate, so the 2.5 billion euros is split between a 1 billion euro mandate managed internally by PGGM and a 1.5 billion euro mandate managed externally by UBS. And in part of the portfolio management is indeed, all the screening and all the analysis on ESG factors, engagement, etc. So it's an actively managed portfolio. Ultimately, we require for every investment made under this particular strategy that we can communicate very briefly, very concisely, why it is that we even want to make this investment, why the impact does indeed outweigh the possible negatives, including negative impacts or perhaps ESG risks, and do so in just 30 seconds. In fact, we put a little test in place to make sure we can actually tell our beneficiaries, our pension fund beneficiaries, that their money is being put to good use. Pensions with purpose. Next slide then is what purpose. So once you know the solutions you're looking for, once you know the companies producing those solutions, at the end of the line we actually want to know how much of an impact do these companies make. For that we've identified just a handful of impact indicators per team. And the one that I've marked in this blue box here are the ones that we've selected for water. Nothing spectacular there. The interesting thing is that these are indicators meant to measure the absolute impact that our investments make. And because we went for absolutes, not a score, but an absolute number, we can also aggregate these different impacts across our entire portfolio, which is the whole point, because that is what we want to communicate ultimately. Again, pensions with purpose. So the approach that we've taken, and Charlie will tell you a whole lot more about this, is that on the basis of a limited set of standard impact indicators, we're trying to measure the relevant reference point, a point in time or a performance reference, what exactly the impact of these investments has been. And the next and the last slide that I'll show you here is what ultimately we do with all of this. We really want to communicate to our 2.7 million pension beneficiaries that we've invested this amount of euros in these four teams with that amount of impact at the end of the line. And we try to work these numbers in such a way that pension beneficiaries can actually get their mind around, how big is that really? And of course, this is a emerging sports, right? This is very much work in progress. The only thing we can say is that we try to get better at it. We are certainly getting better at it every year. And part of the effort has been led, and great credit to UBS for doing this, by a consortium of UBS, Harvard, CUNY, and later on the University of Wageningen here in the Netherlands. But CUNY played an absolutely crucial part in capturing the positive impact of water investments in this particular strategy. And Charlie, over to you to give us the details on that one.
Thanks very much, Piet, and I can't think of a better teeing up of what I'm about to say. So Piet's now outlined fundamental rationale and the general attack on this issue. And again, this is just a wonderful introduction to what I'm going to say, which is really going to be looking a bit more under the hood of the car and taking a look at that engine and seeing exactly what we are talking about in terms of producing a measurable set of attributes that could inform good decision making in terms of impact investing. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you pretty much a quick run through of Earth system science developments that might have a bearing on this particular objective. And I'm not going to hold back. Some of these slides I actually use in my advanced teaching at the City University of New York, and hopefully we'll be able to highlight some of the key points as we go through and get back, in fact, to some of this rationale that Piet had spoken about, but now from the perspective of Earth system science informing these investment decisions. Next slide, please. So let's begin with SDG 1, which is no poverty, right? So the alleviation of the severe poverty that we see across the planet now. And I show a graphic here, which I hope all of you will intuitively understand. On the x-axis or the horizontal axis, we have annual per capita income, so it's a measure of wealth. And on the vertical axis, we have the number of people who are distributed against those wealth classes. We have 3 years shown, 2000, 2030, and 2050. And you'll notice that there's a movement to the right, and this bulge of the curve, which is the global middle class, is now moving to the right. So what we anticipate in the spirit of securing SDG 1, which is to alleviate the worst of the poverty that we see, is that there's going to be a very great benefit in economic terms to many of the people of the planet, and that's great news. Next slide, please. But from the standpoint of H2O, from the standpoint of SDG 6, which is the Sustainable Development Goal for water, if we don't do things differently than we have in the past, we're going to see mounting threats to our inland water systems. And what I'm showing you here is a map of the threats to the water resource systems of the planet as best we can tell in year 2050 if we adopt business as usual practices, which typically is to allow the systems around us, the natural environment, to become impaired, and then through the installation of large-scale engineering facilities and their operations, we try to remediate the threats. And there's a whole sector of the economy, on the order of about $750 billion per year revenue, that attempts to fix this problem. And we see in many different parts of the world an increase. I guess the only one that seems to be going down are the OECD countries. But by and large, we're going to see an intensification of challenges to the water resource systems of the planet for the next many decades. Again, bad news for water, but good news in terms of SDG number 1, which is poverty alleviation. Next slide, please. How are we going to tackle this? Well, the tradition of water resource management has typically been to remediate the threats that we see by what we call gray engineering. or some might call hard path engineering. If you hit the button again, forward button, what we're talking about is large scale dams and reservoir systems, centralized treatment facilities, large-scale irrigation works, interbasin transfers, lots of concrete, lots of pipes, often lots of chemicals, lots of energy, and lots of capital that goes into these systems. There's an emerging community of thought that is now trying to embed green thinking into the way we traditionally have solved our water resource problems. And that's been around for a while, but now it's really taking hold at a much larger scale, at a strategic scale. And I was just at a meeting a couple of months ago, the OECD hosted, on looking at green infrastructure as a potential policy lever in G20 negotiations. And so at the highest levels, at least of government, we're thinking now of being able to take ecosystem-based thinking, we call it natural capital, green infrastructure, if you will, what's shown on the right, and trying to embed that into the strategies for dealing with our water threats. If you hit the button again, the set of iconic images here, just to remind us that intact forests and wetlands and healthy aquatic ecosystems actually help reduce the price tag of the traditional engineering. Just imagine having intact forests giving you clean water, often done in many urban settings around the planet, and it gives you a nice clean water supply that you don't have to then spend additional revenue to try to fix up using the traditional engineering systems. And the concept now that's coming into vogue is these blended systems that you use judiciously the deployment of the gray infrastructure, the traditional infrastructure, alongside of the green infrastructure. Next slide, please. How important could this be strategically and at a global scale? That's one of the things that I and a group of people are doing right now. So there are three maps that are shown on this diagram. The top map is the observed threat. It happens to be contemporary threat. So what we see out there today. So there's a lot of red. Red means lots of bad stuff going on, lots of pollution, overuse of water, water that needs to be substantially treated through typically traditional engineering to make the water ready for use by humans directly. So that's what we start with. That's what the background level of threat is across the planet. And then we did some experiments. We asked, well, what would be the impact of taking the threat away in terms of pollution control? So let's say we had full remediation of all pollution globally using the traditional engineering systems, okay? And then we did another experiment in which we do something similar, but we don't modify the engineering that's out there. What we do is we basically eradicate all bad land use management, all improper watershed stewardship that we see out there on the planet as well. And what we found was something very, very interesting. So the first accounting in that box, that gray box in the middle on the right, is looking at the number of populations exposed to the threat. And the observed kind of extant system has about 75% of the population, about 4.6 billion, under levels of high threat. The next experiment, where we eradicate all pollution using engineering, gets you another 10 to 15% of benefit, reducing the populations exposed to bad situations down to about 4 billion. But the big gain that we see is not with the engineered pollution control, but with the management of those ecosystems. And what's very interesting here is that that's one of the policy levers that has not really been looked at as a strategic resource to us in terms of managing our water systems. And so what we are now seeing is evidence that this green infrastructure, this natural capital, these nature-based solutions, if you will, all synonymic words there, it's actually an important component of the puzzle that we may like to use in the era of the SDGs for potentially good gain. Next slide, please. Okay, so what we did is a couple of years back, we were enlisted by the High-Level Panel on Water, which is a consortium of, I guess it was 11 heads of state, prime ministers and presidents from around the globe, heads of state interested in water security, and they convened through the UN and the World Bank. And this high-level panel, which is now, I guess, disbanded, or they had an outcome report that was published a few months back. They asked for inputs into their thinking. And what we were enlisted to do was to talk about how nature-based solutions or environmentally oriented attacks on the water security problem might help us. And we wrote a paper, and I'll show you a cover page in the next slide, but that paper outlined essentially a conceptual model for doing this. And we tackled a few particular components of SDG 6 on clean water and sanitation. We looked at clean drinking water, sanitation and hygiene itself, pollution and control, and ecosystem protection and restoration. And put these all together in a series of heuristic tests. And if you hit the next slide, please, I'm going to circle that top environmental service. And for example, when we looked at drinking water for cities, we talked about the kinds of gray infrastructure that would modernize drinking water treatment facilities and increase the levels of sanitation and important for drinking water, because lots of the world's sanitation and sewage systems dump raw sewage into waterways, and those waterways are used downstream by people who need drinking water. So if you want drinking water security, you've got to begin cleaning up the sewage systems that are dumping into these river systems. So we can talk about things like that. We can talk about minimizing and avoiding water losses through leaking pipes and such. On the green side, we're talking about watershed protection, especially contributing areas upstream of intakes to, for example, urban water supplies that are done throughout the world. We are talking about reforesting these upstream systems. We're talking about preserving natural ecosystems on the edges of waterways, which do a fantastic job of cleaning runoff coming from the uplands. So these are the kinds of things that we looked at. Next slide, please. It looks a bit complicated here, but let me step you through this. So what we're showing on the right side on that panel is a graphic with a horizontal axis once again showing here utilization of green infrastructure from low levels to high levels. And we're showing gray infrastructure, or that traditional infrastructure, from levels of insufficient service down at the bottom, progressively moving up to advanced levels of service. And those images on either side are just to remind us what we're talking about. And we did a set of worked examples, okay? And in each of the cases you see these colored discs, and each of these pairs has a numeric, number 1, which represents conditions in the year 2015 when the SDGs began, and A2, what we might expect as an aspiration by year 2030, okay? And each of the colors represents a different case study. In the top right corner, we reason that the best place to be if you're talking about sustainability is to the highest degree possible, use your green assets in a sensible way. Use that natural capital in a good way, in a sustainable way. And try to advance your level of service to the highest degree possible and economically feasible in that period of time. So we can take these examples. The first example, A1 and A2, is Kabul, Afghanistan, where in the current situation with insufficient water services from the traditional engineering, and you'd also not have very much green infrastructure that helps you today get that water to the citizens of that city. In the period of the SDGs, by 2030, you move to A2, which hopefully gets most of the people in the city to a basic level of service. And they probably don't have a lot of green infrastructure, but they would try to use as much as they had creatively. On the right, you have B1 to B2. That's Kampala, Uganda. They're already using natural infrastructure and wetland systems to reduce pollution burdens for ultimately the intake for drinking water into the city. They have high levels of green infrastructure use already, but generally insufficient service otherwise. And by the period of 2015 to 2030, that brings them to B2, the idea would be to bring more basic service from traditional infrastructure, but at the same time, do not destroy the value of that green infrastructure. B1, B2 is from the drainage basin of the Catskills and the New York City water supplies. This is, I'm speaking out of a great self-interest to know that we have advanced levels of service in terms of the quality of our water. We use a good deal of green infrastructure. We could use even more, and the evidence for that is that there are about 100 or more advanced sewage treatment plants that have to treat the water that are then fed, the water systems that are then feeding into the New York City water supply. And we could do an even better job of protecting those watersheds in the future. As I mentioned, this was a paper solicited by the High-Level Panel on Water. It appeared in Ecohydrology and Hydrobiology, shown on the bottom left there, and that was published a couple of months ago. Next slide, please. Well, the High-Level Panel on Water is, of course, representing governmental interests in this, and these are heads of state after all. And it's one thing to be soliciting the energies of governments in all this, but it's quite another thing to try to get the business community involved in this. And I think at the end of the day, getting those discs or those balloons to the top right corner of that graphic is going to be well beyond the capabilities of governments alone. I think we really have to create new business models and get the business community to understand that this kind of thinking, working with nature, actually can yield profit and make it attractive, make that thinking attractive to the investment community. In order to do that, you have to plant the right kinds of cues into the system, and the kinds of information that we're really talking about to allow appropriate decisions to be made are to produce transparent, traceable, and reliable metrics. The bread and butter, as it were, of peer-reviewed science. And so we come to this question, or I come to this question with my colleagues as scientists, thinking that there can be some enormous value in having scientists provide appropriately interpreted information to the business community on these kinds of opportunities. And as you'll see in a minute, we're really trying to go beyond typical ESG thinking, which is often practice-oriented at the facility level, and really move out into the real-world context, into kind of the consumer domain of all of the products and services that are distributed by companies in the real world. We published a paper back in February of this year in Science magazine on all of this with our colleagues also from Harvard School of Public Health, UBS at PGGM. And I would think that we can make this publication available as kind of a supplement to this seminar that I understand Monika is going to make available to people. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so in the water domain, we were asked to take a look at creating a set of these initial impact metrics that dealt with issues of water scarcity, water quality, water access, and ecosystem health. All of what is very much part and parcel of SDG 6 and in fact many other SDGs. And so the idea is that the issue of these water challenges that we see facing humanity need to have, in some sense, a friend, let's put it that way, in terms of appropriately operating ecosystems. And it makes no sense to provide all of these water services if you're destroying the backbone of the service in the first place, the provisioning service of water from nature, if you happen to be not keeping your eye on the appropriate management of the environment. And as I showed from those maps earlier, there is a pandemic mismanagement of natural ecosystems to the point where we have to keep fixing them and fixing them and fixing them to solve our water security needs. And we think there's a better way to do this. Next slide, please. So the key to what we did in terms of the UBS PGGM engagement was to try to create a set of indicators that made sense not only to what could be measured in terms of business practices of particular companies, but also what happens when those business practices are articulated in the context of the environment and also in terms of who these products and services are benefiting. So we crafted a conceptual model of outputs, and I'll show you a diagram of that in the next slide, outputs, outcomes, and impacts. And the idea was to go beyond just business practices, in particular at the production facility stage, but to look at what we call the consumer use phase set of benefits. And this diagram here is just trying to capture that we can tabulate what's happening at a particular factory that manufactures, for example, pumps and tanks that are then installed in sewage treatment facilities. And while we are interested in what the factory activities might yield in terms of pollution and reduction of pollution if you institute good practices, we're also interested in what happens to these products and services when they go out into the real world and when they are attempting, for example, to clean up waterways in the case of sewage treatment plants. And the diagram here is just really showing that the production that comes out of that factory goes somewhere and it's put to good use, and it's put to good use in different contexts. Okay, and I'd like to highlight that in the next slide, please. So this is a very complicated diagram. I'm not going to go over much of the detail, except to say that we had really three different components to the effort. The first was to collect the appropriate data sets, and that meant collecting either self-disclosed or publicly available data sets about the companies that we were looking at. We also had on the bottom there what you might term Earth System Science data sets that were both environmental and social in nature. We are able, using our computer simulations and our data compendia, to begin to map out where water supplies are abundant, where they're not abundant, where there are river threats, as I showed in some of these maps, what populations are out there, what populations are affected, whether they're protected natural ecosystems that are at risk, et cetera, et cetera. So we take those data sets and we put them into our hydrological modeling scheme, and this is basically trying to capture the water balances and the water fluxes and dynamics that we see in river basins across the world and across the space in which products are distributed for particular companies. So as best we can, we try to harmonize the geospatial aspects of the question with the corporate data sets. We put that all together and we place that into our simulation models, and we make estimates and of water flows, of pollution loads, of people that are exposed to different levels of these particular dynamics. And that comes out in a set of sustainability indices. And what we do is we try to create a set of intuitive impact values, just as one example. We have the dollars conveyed to water improvements that can be expressed per cubic meter or per gallon, if you will, of water that's treated, or per person that's served by these water systems. And putting this all together, figuring out what are the flows and who are the beneficiaries, we can begin to come up with sustainability indices. We can look across different sectors, as Pete alluded to earlier. We can also look within a sector, in the water sector, see which companies are doing better or worse than others. And in an individual company, you could track all of this over time and see if the company is veering off the road a bit, in terms of its sustainability impacts, positive impacts, or if it's going in a more positive direction. Next slide, please. Just to highlight a little bit about why this is important to look at the question in this way, we do a little heuristic example here. And again, we talk about outputs, outcomes, and impacts. And on the top, we see something called outputs. These are facility-level data. This is status quo in terms of self-disclosure by companies. These are typically focused on site-based operations, as I indicate there. And we simulated here a drainage basin where we have uplands at the top of the diagram, and at the bottom you have an arrow indicating that river basin either flows into the ocean or maybe a larger river system. And organized in that river system, and water, remember, flows downhill, is urban area 1, 2, and 3, and sewage treatment plant A and B. Sewage treatment plant A serving the needs of the people in urban area 1, and B associated with urban area 2. And if you were to make a judgment as to, let's say there are two different companies, A and B, and they are producing products that operate these wastewater treatment facilities, like big pumps. If the volume of water treated is reported to be identical by company A and company B, you would have nothing else to go on except to say that they have an equivalent benefit on the water situation. But in point of fact, when you begin to look at this in a broader perspective, you see a very different set of answers coming out. The second graphic down there with the blue embedded within it is the environmental context in which these wastewater treatment facilities are operating. They're trying to clean the water. And without these types of facilities, the impairment, the water quality impairment will go shooting up to very high levels. But then the effect of the plants, A and B, can be articulated as a set of blue colors. And the question here is, which of the two plants, A or B, when you put all this into the context of the river system, creates the best impact on the environment? And the way to interpret that is to look at which of these has more blue, okay? And clearly, in this case, wastewater treatment plant A has much more positive benefit than B. That's one way to look at it. So that's positive, and it's a different answer than A and B are equivalent. The third way we can look at this is the actual beneficiaries. And again, this is a drainage basin. So anytime you clean sewage out of a system that would dump that sewage into a river that becomes the water supply for someone downstream, cleaning up that waste stream benefits people. And we can begin to tabulate the number of people who are benefiting. And by that measure alone, it's not system A, it's system B that yields the most beneficiaries, most impact in that particular way of looking at the question. So we would just issue the caution to anyone looking at this that you can't simply look at operations at the plant level. You have to actually begin looking at this at a deeper level. Next, please. Okay, another thing that we're trying to do is we're trying to create what we call opportunity maps for the business community to look at areas of the planet where they might do most good. So a company that's in the business, let's say, of producing equipment for drinking water systems might ask, well, where's the greatest need in terms of populations that are in need of this kind of technology? And we can easily begin to make maps of this. On the top left, we see this as an investment opportunity map. And the way to interpret all of these maps is that the blue colors indicate greater opportunity, and lower opportunities are associated with the yellow and the red colors. So you can begin to look at the investment opportunity and say, I'm going to go sailing right into Africa, and I'm going to do all good that I possibly can with drinking water. But then you need to delimit that optimism, as it were, with some of these investment challenges that come about for often non-technical reasons, whether there are fragile states there, whether regulations are in place, whether there's graft and corruption, whether you're in multinational drainage basins, that might be prone to water conflict. And you also have to take into account on the top right there the negative impacts of too much engineering, which have in many, many parts of the world debilitated natural ecosystems and hurt the very water systems that we are trying to rely upon. Just a perfect example is putting too many dams and reservoirs into a drainage basin for, let's say, drinking water supply or irrigation, and completely decimating the natural ecosystem that you have built those dams and reservoirs on. So with a simple calculation of positive investment opportunities minus these investment challenges minus the negative impacts of investment, you come up with a final larger scale map that looks a bit different than what you originally thought your investment opportunities would be. And again, what this is trying to do is it's trying to capture the spatiality of the question, and it's also trying to merge what you might call the geophysical aspects of the question with the social science and policy implications of making investments in different parts of the world. Next slide, please. Okay, I also wanted to just to alert the group on the webinar here that we're at the cusp of a new capability coming to us from the Earth System science community, and I was fortunate enough to be working with an international consortium for water sciences. It's called Water Future. It's located at Griffith University in Brisbane, Australia, and we've brought together a consortium of scientists to look at water problems at a variety of scales, from global down to very local, and trying to craft innovative solutions to water problems. One of the things that we've begun to do is to create near real-time pictures of water resource threat, really bringing strategic information into the hands of potential users like policymakers and investors, looking at water situation in a very short period of latency, let's say the last couple of months. Next slide, please, just to give you a visual of what that's about. On the top, we are able now to map, for example, irrigated areas and the level of threat to those systems. Again, red and black are bad colors, blue is less stress. And we can do this in virtually near real time, which really opens the door to being able to look at where situations are arising that might need deployments of particular technologies on a very, very short time frame. So this, we think, is an important strategic planning tool. This Compass group that we've assembled through Water Future is producing these kinds of water state indices like I show above. We're doing 6-month outlooks. We're also doing longer-term trends in terms of what's happening in terms of SDG attainment of SDG 6. We're producing national report cards along the lines of what's shown on the right. And we also will, on a customized basis, produce business intelligence and risk reports. And for that, we'd like to pair up with the business community and interested partners in this. Next slide, please. So we're looking for partnerships of two types. So the first is a kind of a broader strategic dialogue to really co-design these what you might call science-based metrics for impact investing. Of necessity, that strategic alliance would include asset owners and managers. It would include particular companies, auditors, NGOs, and of course the scientific research community. Along with this particular seminar, which is trying to motivate some discussion and interest in this area, we're going to be hosting in 2019 at the AAAS annual meetings a session on sustainable investing. It's on February 16th from 10 to 11:30 in Washington. So that's a plug for anyone interested on the call now to try to attend that particular meeting. And Science Magazine has taken a particular interest in this issue, knowing it's important for the business community to talk to the sciences. We've also initiated a working group headed up by the OECD, the Water Future, and the UN World Water Assessment Program, which is the designated body for all UN agencies and the member states to craft an assessment of the state of water affairs throughout time. And anyone who would be interested in joining that team should contact me. I'll give you some contact information in the next couple of slides. Next, please. Next slide, please. Okay. And we're also looking for partnerships in a more targeted way. So taking the kinds of things that I've just spoken about and what Piet had given a nice introduction to, and to begin testing this out in kind of a pioneer mode, we found that it was very difficult to go very much farther beyond what was publicly disclosed by particular companies or what was a matter of public records. And we think that in the appropriate testing environment, and maybe thinking of this in a non-disclosure type of a setting, to be able to sit with what we might call pioneer companies and be interested in trying to share the right kinds of information, in particular where products are being sold, and assessing what the impact of those deployments of products are in the real world. And the benefit to any company that wishes to work with us would be to have a systematic way of assessing how well it's doing in terms of this kind of consumer phase of its business operations, and to see what positive impact is occurring over time. So you could actually track the performance of a particular company over time, which we think would be absolutely essential in terms of business practices. The second way that we are targeting this engagement is to enlist the interest of anyone in the business community who wishes to work with us on these business intelligence and risk reports. Again, trying to capitalize on this new capability in the Earth System Scientists, which is this near real-time assessment of water supply and water stress, which we've been working on, as I showed you a couple of slides ago. And also helping us in making strategic forecasts of the state of the system over time, near term and longer. Next slide, I think, is my additional information. So anyone who's interested, please look us up on those websites. And if you have particular questions, I've given you my email contact and also the executive director of Water Future with respect to the Compass exercise. With that, I am done with my slide deck. Thank you.
Thank you both, Charlie and Piet. I rarely go back and re-listen to the recordings, but I know for this one I will. There's a lot of richness and detail, and really grateful for the presentation and the really interesting work. We do have one question that came in, and it is to Piet. Given the very comprehensive approach, can you summarize, what the results were from this analysis, and the time frame, and how is that going to influence potentially some of the ways the pension fund looks at water or will do things differently?
Right. To start with the last one, right now we are just looking for accounting for the impact that our investments are creating. So accounting is short of managing for maximum impact. I think that is an important distinction. Charlie talked about all the information that we have to highlight, where the risks are and where indeed the needs are. We are looking at this slightly differently, perhaps, in the sense that we use this information to simply take account of the impact of our investments, without necessarily maximizing or adjusting our portfolio for maximum impact. Now, this is important. If we account for that impact, then we look at the companies in our portfolio, in this listed equities portfolio, that actually produce these water benefits. And we do so every year. And at the last time we reported this, at the end of 2017, we had about €1 billion invested in water, and we reported that we had about 6 million cubic meters of water saved, 250 million cubic meters of water wastewater treated. So it's the aggregated numbers that we report to our beneficiaries. I think the key thing here is that what is new here? There's three new things, I believe. One is the focus on products and services. Rather than corporate behavior, we actually look at what comes out of their their production line, out of the company gate, if you wish, and where indeed these products and services have been put to use. So context is the next big thing. So we try to get our mind around, what is it that companies produce, and where is that making an impact? And the third thing then is indeed that we try to get to that impact by modeling revenues or finding conversion factors that convert revenues to impacts. Now, the latter, of course, is where the rub is. That's pretty difficult, and we do understand that this is something that is definitely going to improve over time. The good thing about that approach is that even though the results may not be super accurate, at least they're scalable. And that's important to us, right? If you manage a lot of money, you can't go very deep on any individual company, but you do want to have a pretty solid understanding of what the aggregated impact is. So scalability of this approach is the key for us. Now, with time, we hope that we can do better, become indeed more accurate by breaking down those sales to specific geographies, to specific social segments of the population, perhaps to get closer to where the needs are, so where indeed we can have perhaps more impact per euro. We're not there yet, though. We're not there yet. Data is definitely the key constraint here, but this is what we envisage.
Thank you, Piet. We probably have time for one more question. So there is a question asking for Piet as well. Could you talk about the information investors are interested in receiving in terms of impact? It seems like the information in slide 10 are more outcome versus impact. Let me go back to that slide.
Yeah. That's a good question. Of course, we do understand the distinction between output, outcome, and impact. And I think in many cases, what we're really getting here is outcomes, right? And for us right now, that's good enough. We look at our water investments, and we are quite happy to account for, the cubic meters of water saved, treated, etc. Who's benefiting, and for how long, is a question that's beyond that number, right? And one day, hopefully, we'll get there. But for now, we're quite happy with outcomes and not technically impact, even though we use that word quite frequently.
Great. Thank you, Piet. I know we're out of time. We will, just before we wrap, what I did want to remind everybody that we do have an upcoming speaker series, Thursday, December 13th, from speakers from the weather insurance and climate and weather science side, and what lessons can be learned from those fields for better portfolio management and ESG and water risk integration. But I do want to thank so much Charlie and Piet for this work. I want to remind folks, Ceres actually will be producing a summary of the research and the implications in one of our Investor Water Toolkit case studies. So do look for more information on this research and this work, which I think has been very groundbreaking. We will also send the slides, recordings, and the papers that Charlie referenced, along with email addresses if folks have follow-on questions or are interested in any of the pilot studies and partnerships that Charlie was mentioning. So again, thank you all for joining us, and thank you especially to our two speakers.